In the game against 100 Flugel, victory was nearly at hand for Sora and Shiro. At every turn, they had outmatched their opponents with new strategies, utilizing the words that they could make in the game, manifesting their intentions into reality. But victory alone would not be enough, for there was one who still did not understand what the point of the entire game was. Azril, the alley-potentiary of the Flugel, and Jabril had made a wager unbeknownst to Sora and Shiro, that put the entirety of the race of Flugel on the line. For this game to truly be won, there was more that had to be achieved. Before we return to that game, though, we do need to check back in Elkia with Steph and Izuna. And Steph, unfortunately, had messed up. Steph and Izuna were now walking hand in hand through the city of Elkia, as Steph needed to acquire some fish to, well, feed Izuna. But while they were walking through, Steph could very easily see the looks that people were giving Izuna, muttering under their breath, hurling insults at her. Because Werebeast was a conqueror. They were the ones who had stolen the continental domain from Elkia. And those kind of relations aren't so easily forgotten. Something that Steph completely overlooked. And of course, Izuna, with her Werebeast senses, could hear all of this as well, and Steph felt bad for subjecting her to this. But Izuna really didn't pay it any mind, and instead asked Steph a surprising question. Or rather, asked Stutch a surprising question. Why don't you hate me? Which, coming from an 8-year-old girl, having Izuna ask Steph, why don't you hate me? That has to be painful. And Steph thought about it. Why doesn't she hate Izuna? Given everything that happened, given that, Werebeasts did take the continental domain, the feelings would kind of make sense. Then again, it was a loss that was accrued in a game of mutual agreement. The old king had bet the continental domain in a game against Werebeast and had lost fair and square. But still, some of those feelings remained. Instead, though, Steph softly smiled at Izuna and just simply said, I don't know. Which caused Izuna to respond calling her an idiot, but Steph went a bit further, saying that she just feels that it's wrong. She doesn't know why, but it's wrong. Plus, Steph likes Izuna, so she's going to give her preferential treatment. Again, Izuna reiterates that Steph's an idiot, but it still warms Izuna's heart, as, when they're walking hand in hand, Izuna's hand slightly tightens around Steph's. And then something unexpected happens. A group of children notice Izuna and run up to her, all excited, wanting to play her in a game. Izuna says, of course, that she's hungry, so she'll play them next time, but Steph was surprised, saying, what, this group of children, are you guys all friends? Because noticeably, there was both Imanity and Werebeast children present. And they looked up at her and said, of course, we became friends by playing games together. And Izuna said she'll have to challenge them next time, and the kids ran off. Steph thought to herself that the world was changing, and rapidly at that. That if anyone couldn't see that the world was changing, they were just simply choosing not to. Soon, by the time that these kids were adults, it would be laughable that the races were ever at odds with one another. That was the future that Steph could see. The future that Sora and Shiro were bringing about. The world was rapidly changing, and the races were coming together. The world that had initially been envisioned by Tet was truly coming to fruition. Elsewhere, though, a different world was being rewritten. Back on Avontheim, the world that Sora and Shiro had been flying through, that world of cubes, had been completely transformed. The sky had become blood red. They could see the seas around themselves dried up. There was innumerable pieces of rubble floating in the air around Sora and Shiro, and they could see Avontheim floating in the distance. Not the Avontheim that they had been flying upon, but rather Avontheim as it was during the time of the Great War. Not covered in cubes, but instead in artillery. The amount of spirits that were present rewriting the world was something that was making Plum practically pass out. Plum said that this was something that not even the Flugel could be capable of. Only an old day, or a phantasma, exceed rank 2, remembering where they actually were on the back of a phantasma, a discrete world. The amount of spirits that it could employ was more than anything that Plum had ever seen. And so the game's stage was rewritten to that of one that expressed what the world was like at the end of the Great War, when the world was in ruin. Azril then appears in the sky before Sora and Shiro and starts claiming that we do not understand. We do not know why our Lord was slain. At the end of the Great War, our Lord wrapped up all of the Flugel's heavenly smites in an attack of his own, a godly smite, and yet it was reflected back upon him, and wenceforth our Lord was slain. We do not understand the purpose why we still live, why we have survived. And they were going to continue their monologuing until a word was yelled out. The word artillery. And then Azril, or rather, something that looked like Azril, was shot from the sky by the howitzer that was now protruding from Sora and Shiro's hands. They had used their words to cut the dialogue short, because, well, too much dialogue in a game is just going to cause the gamers to skip, because they just want to get to the good part. Plum, on the other hand, is quite shocked at what Sora and Shiro just did by shooting Azril out of the sky, and Sora simply said, yeah, well, we shot Azril and, I guess, Avontheim out of the sky. Plum hadn't quite caught on, but Sora explains that, well, Azril is the only Flugel with a horn, so we figured it's something like that Azril is the agent plenipotentiary for Avontheim, the Phantasma. So she had the ability to utilize all of the magic that Avontheim had. Not to mention that Avontheim is the stage. So for all of this to change, that must mean that Sora and Shiro are still on Avontheim, and thus the Avontheim they see in the distance is an illusion. Thus, the Azril that appeared before them was also an illusion. Case in point, they were able to shoot her out of the air in the first place. They were able to enact physical violence upon her when the Covenants should have prevented that. Meaning that that thing that was flying above them was indeed a fake. And so, Sora and Shiro, with grins upon their faces, ask Plum what she thinks this all means. The fact that there was a last-minute stage switch. The fact that a being appeared in front of them and started monologuing. What would this all mean? And Plum racked her brain and came up with an answer. The end? Which, surprisingly to Sora and Shiro, was exactly right. This is the last boss stage, and so Sora and Shiro jump into it with glee, as Avontheim in the distance starts unleashing a barrage of artillery. No longer are they the homing capture beams that the Flugel were firing individually and controlling them. Now it was just a relentless barrage. Innumerable amounts of capture beams were raining down upon them, and they were swiftly and deftly dodging through all of them. Shiro being able to calculate out the attack patterns, while Sora was just, dodging on adrenaline, as one does. In total, there were 46 syllables available in the game for Sora and Shiro to capture and then utilize, to make their intentions into reality and help them in this game. They were still currently missing 6 syllables, and throughout the game they had already used 23 syllables, which means they had 17 currently available to them. The word that Sora wanted to put into her, however, required 13 syllables on its own, and they were still missing 3 syllables. Shiro had no idea what Sora was planning, but she thought to herself, when she doesn't know, then her brother is right. There is no more need to think about it further than that. So that ultimately meant that they would need to gather the remaining 6 syllables that they were still missing. The syllables that were still out there somewhere on the bodies of the Flugel present within the game. And they weren't going to be able to do that while also dodging the barrage of fire coming from Avontheim. So that meant that Sora would have to use one of their trumps. Their trumps being the words that they could create. Words that could be used for defense, for evasion, or for attacks. And so, Sora decided to use one of those for an attack, as he raised his arm grandly in the air and swept it out, saying the word, disconnect. And in a absurd display, everything in front of him, the debris all floating around them, and even Avontheim itself in the distance was split in two. which also caused the artillery to stop. And once it did, 18 Flugel approached Sora and Shiro. All 6 of the syllables that they were after were present, but this was more Flugel than they were expecting. Sora and Shiro turned ready for a fight, ready to take on the last stage of the game, but they were surprised when the Flugel stopped before them. One stepped forward and asked if they require the syllable as she presented it to them, and the 5 others who had syllables inscribed on their bodies stepped forward and did the same. Sora and Shiro were confused by this, but the Flugel simply said that we've seen all we needed to. We had fun playing the game together. And so we ask our future lords and saviors to please take care of our sister Azril. And so Sora and Shiro couldn't help but laugh at the trick that Jabril had baked into this game. Plum, who was confused by all this, asked what's going on, and the Flugel simply responded to the worm, a casual insult just tossed at Plum, that although they are Flugel under the leadership of Azril, before that, they are fans of Sora and Shiro. This entire game, the 100 Flugel that were present, that were friends of Jabril, were fans of Sora and Shiro because of the teachings that Jabril had set forth, because she had been telling all of Flugel about Sora and Shiro's exploits. And all of the 100 Flugel that were there were already on Sora and Shiro's side from the beginning. They just wanted to, well, play games with them. The entire stakes that the Flugel were playing this game for were in fact the ability to get signatures, to get hugs, to have dates with Sora and Shiro. And so, after having their fun, they offered up the syllables in return. Watching this from the sidelines, both Azril and Jabril could see everything that was happening. And Jabril turned to Azril and says, "So, some of the others understand. Why don't you, Azril?" Azril did not respond to this. Her expression was blank. But behind that expression was torment. She didn't understand. She couldn't grasp it. Why were they all laughing and smiling when they were being outplayed? And even more, after Sora and Shiro had severed the illusion, the scenery of old had been revealed, and they, Sora and Shiro, were heading straight for her, as if they knew that she'd be there. They, in fact, had concluded that Azril and Jabril would still be in the same place that they had started the game in. And what Azril was feeling was the same as the time when her lord was slain. She was feeling afraid. Darting through the falling debris of Avant-Time, Sora and Shiro were forced to use more of their words to reach their goal. As a large piece of rubble was falling before them, they called out the word minuscule to shrink the rubble to a smaller size. It was still not enough, though. Only enough to open a small gap, small enough that they would not be able to fit through. And so they called out another word, decamp, to essentially teleport to the other side of it. Decamp means to, depart suddenly, so the intention of that word was them to escape through that gap, and so they were able to escape the rubble. When I first read it, I didn't really know what that word meant either. While this is all happening, though, Plum is still screaming like a banshee in the background, and Sora asks Plum to bare her fangs for him, as there's something else that he'd like her to do, but Plum, of course, sternly objects. She's already doing so much already, and she's probably on the brink of passing out. But Sora says, well, that's a real shame, because I was thinking of giving you some blood. Before he can even finish the word, Plum presses her fangs to the nape of his neck. Since she is masking herself in the physical plane, Sora couldn't actually see where her fangs are, so pressing them against his neck makes sense. He did not give permission for her to actually, bite down or anything, so Sora's not going to be infected with the illness, but he does use another one of the words on his finger. He uses the word gore to cause blood to bubble out from his finger without actually causing an incision. And he presses that blood to Plum's fangs. And Plum, who now, having drank blood through her fangs, was elated at the new taste that she was experiencing, saying that she was filled with so much soul she felt like she could do anything now. Well, that's great to hear, Sora said. So, Let's see you do anything, then. Plum sighed at this response, figuring that it was going to be something like that. Azril, on the other hand, was reminiscing about a time long past. 6,000 years ago, at the end of the Great War, when the Flugel had lost their purpose. Their lord was slain. They were created to kill gods and were now left without a purpose. And instead, what a lot of the Flugel decided to do was simply not think at all. Many of them gathered all of their power in their hands and started stabbing themselves. Azril, unable to bear watching her sisters die, told a lie. She told them that their late lord's last wish was yet to be fulfilled. He had told her that if he would be slain, that they were to figure out the cause. That was their final mission. In fact, it was a mission that had only been assigned to Azril, but she played it off as a mission assigned to all of Flugel. And so, for the next 6,000 years, the Flugel gathered knowledge, and tried to find the answer as to why their lord was slain, to find the answer as to why they still existed. Azril figured that if anyone could find it, it could only be Jibril, the irregular number, the one outside the series, the imperfect one. But still, after 6,000 years of searching, Azril was just tired of it all. Sora and Shiro arrived in the hall where Azril and Jibril waited. They used a last syllable to say the word Ray and illuminate the floor. Now they had used up all of their syllables and only had 13 remaining. The 13 that were needed for Sora's final word. They could see Azril standing in front of an empty throne, with Jibril standing next to her, eyes closed. The expression on her face was one of hope and conviction, as well as faith in what would happen next. This was an emotion completely absent from Azril, as she stood there saying that this vain world, this fruitless life searching for a non-existent answer has grown tiresome. The true feelings of the living beings of Azril and Avantime, or rather, the true feelings of a puppet and a fantasy. If the answer that Jibril had found, the answer that Sora and Shiro are supposed to present to them, matches the lie that they had told all those years prior, then they would deem that the reason for their failure was one of absurdity, and they would end all of Flugel. Sora doesn't exactly take kindly to this. Not only the fact that, Azril and Jibril had this kind of a bet going on in the background, and he's going to have to scold Jibril later for betting her life without consulting him first, but also that he can't identify nor relate to what Azril's going through, that they've spent thousands of years searching for some stupid answer. But then he just does say something that is incredibly relevant and impactful. You, he says, referencing Azril, have you ever thought of something and written it down yourself? To which Azril has no response, because she hasn't. And as Sora says this, Jibril clutches the book that she's been holding close to her chest. Her holy scripture, the journal that she's been keeping of Sora and Shiro's exploits. She has been writing down everything that Sora and Shiro has done, and that is what she has been spreading to all of Flugel. This is her holy scripture, something that means the world to Jibril, something that she has written herself. She has formed new knowledge. She has created and written something new to learn, which is at the core of all of this. Sora continues saying that he understands that they had this bet going on, but asks Azril if she gets why Jibril was willing to agree to this in the first place, why she was willing to lay down her life for this. Azril's response was simply that, well, Jibril must have thought that you would present a reasonable answer, and Sora cuts her off, saying, "You're stupid. You're just stupid, and you expect her to call you big sister? How do you think that this is acting like a big sister?" She was risking her life because she had faith in her big sister that she would understand. But you don't, because you're stupid. And with that, Sora leapt at Azril. But to Azril, who had the power of Avant-Time within her, it seemed as if Sora and Shiro were moving in slow motion. 'Twas less than a moment before Azril was right in front of them, and was easily able to grab them. But what she grabbed was not Sora and Shiro. Instead, all she grabbed was a scarf, which transformed into a Dampier girl that started screaming, saying, "Oh, please don't hurt me!" The name of which Azril did not know. She had no clue who Plum was because Azril never bothered to ask the worm's name. But then something surprised her, as next to her she saw something flew past. Using the word of acceleration, Sora and Shiro were right next to her, and tagged her shoulder, yelling out, exclaiming, the final word that Sora wanted to speak. "Epitomize this creature with our own restrictions." More of a sentence than a word? I don't know Japanese. I don't know how exactly to translate the entire sentence, "epitomize this creature with our own restrictions," into a single word. But you know what? Apparently it works. Maybe it's a number of words, or really, the only word that matters is the word restrictions. Because Sora and Shiro's intent is manifested in the game. And that word worked on Azril, as she felt the entirety of the power of Avant-Time, of Exceed Rank 2, of Phantasma within her, being sealed away. Azril, for her part, couldn't believe it. Not the word that had been spoken into her, but the two Imanities, now moving at inhuman speeds, using that word of acceleration. Now without their scarf, they would inevitably crash and die in an instant. She couldn't believe what it was that they were doing. And then she heard, 60 minutes, exactly. Game over. The timer that Shiro had been counting down in her head had reached 0 at the exact moment after tagging Azril. And so Jabril received her masters in her embrace. She caught them so they wouldn't crash to their death. It was absurd. How could they have planned all of this? No matter how much planning and effort you put into strategizing for a game, at the end of all of that planning still lied the unknown. Azril could not understand. She couldn't fathom it. She didn't need to think back. This was unmistakably the same feeling that she had felt when her lord was slain. Unmistakably, this was fear. After having the power of Avant-Time within her sealed, and witnessing this series of unbelievable events, Azril felt her consciousness fade away. And in a dream, she was brought back to the only time that her lord had ever talked about defeat. Her lord said that I am strong, and because I am strong, there are things that I do not know. And because there are things that I do not know, things that are only known to the weak, one day I may be defeated. Azril did not understand what her lord was talking about, but because there are things beyond his knowledge, for that reason he decided to create a being with imperfection, that to one as strong as himself could never be known. As such a time that he would be vanquished from this world, in the guise of the defeated, Azril, you will determine the cause, so that I may rest in peace. This was the final task that Artosh had given to Azril, and Azril couldn't fathom what her lord was thinking. As he talked of defeat, he had a wild grin on his face, as he looked towards the unknown, wanting some unknown opponent to come and face him. The look on his face was of one desiring to defeat even that unknown opponent. And so he went to create one outside the series, the irregular number, the imperfect one. And then he spoke her name, Jabril. Azril then awoke to see Jabril, Sora, and Shiro standing over her. Her body felt heavy. She couldn't fly, and she couldn't really even figure out how to move in this body that she had now. The ceiling felt so high above her. The idea that she had once flown and been able to reach that unreachable space seemed like a fantasy. Her abilities had been restricted to that of an Imanities. She couldn't fly, she couldn't use magic, she couldn't even see spirits. Concepts that she had never even considered before were now tying her down. Things like distance and weight. And Sora's response to this was to ask her how the ground tasted. Not too bad, right? You only really want to fly once you've crashed once, which Azril thought was an odd statement, implying as though crashing wasn't a bad thing. But Sora continued, "Come on, when you fall, you gotta get up. Next round's coming, right?" As Sora extended a hand to Azril and smiled, as if to say, "Just as we've done." And now, finally, Azril understood and couldn't help but grin as she grabbed Sora's hand and was pulled to her feet. Jabril, at this, called Azril once again too hard-headed, but Azril, in turn, now called Jabril too soft-headed. Azril understood why Jabril had done all of those things in the past, why she had faced impossible opponents, why she had gone out on her own, had left Avantime in the first place. She was the definition of imperfect. But what imperfection meant was the desire to be perfect, to constantly drive yourself, to throw yourself against the same wall over and over again to achieve the impossible. And in doing so, Jabril, the imperfect one, had become stronger than anyone. Imperfection simply meant the quest to be perfect, something that Azril and Artosh could never grasp, being ones who never lost. But after the Great War, they were already defeated, and living in the guise of the defeated had already made them imperfect. Azril was just too scared to see it. She was unable to face the unknown that lie before her. What to do after you've already lost. But now, having lost again, having her eyes opened by Sora and Shiro, she finally understands that there was nothing to understand in the first place. The answer that Flugel had sought for 6,000 years was that there was no answer at all. The unknown could never become the known, for the known thereafter becomes the unknown. Yesterday's knowledge is today's folly. Life is a constant cycle of learning. And so, Azril decides that from now on, the Flugel will embrace the unknown, the change that comes with it and the risks that follow. And from here on out, she would just enjoy life and everything that comes with it, so that she could approach it, so that she could approach the unknown, approach perfection, but you would never be able to reach it. Jabril tells Azril that it was their inability to understand this that lost them the war. But the moment that Jabril lost to her masters, knelt before them and pledged herself to them, Artosh's final wish was already fulfilled. And so Azril looks down and mutters to herself, now that she's found the answer, has she also fulfilled her lord's final request? At this, though, Sora breaks the tension by saying that Azril actually looks cute now. And so Azril has a couple questions to ask the Amenities. No, to ask Sora and Shiro. 4 questions in particular. She asks, what do each of them live for? Sora answers Shiro. Shiro answers her brother. Then she asks, what would you do if one of you died? Well, that's irrelevant. We'd die together, so doesn't matter. What were you born for? No clue, was Sora and Shiro's response. They have no idea why they were born, and don't really have time to think about it, because, unlike you, Flugel, our lives are short. All of these were answers that were given immediately. Sora and Shiro just gave those responses on reflex. But they weren't Azril's answers. She could only use them as reference. And so she asked her 4th question. Can I be Jibs? In other words, Azril was asking, could she be like Jabril? And Sora immediately answered yet again, nope, you can only be yourself. But what's wrong with that? Right now, she looks cute, and Sora likes the way that she is now. After everything that Azril had been through, she essentially gets go back to the starting line. You have to figure out all of these answers for yourself. But Azril, now having her eyes opened, thinks that that's okay. As long as she knows that she can, then that's enough. She'll find those answers on her own. In the meantime, though, Jabril was apologizing to Sora for betting her life on the game. But then Sora reveals the actual lie that Azril had told. Or I guess the second lie. Because she did lie to all of the Flugel with the mission that had only been given to Azril and passed it off as the answer to all Flugel. And when she did that, she forbade all Flugel from taking their own lives, instead asking them to entrust that right to Azril, essentially saying, you can't die without permission. But Sora had figured out that that entire thing, you can't die without permission, but even if that permission is given back to the Flugel, that doesn't mean they have to do it. Azril never possessed the right to end all of Flugel. She just possessed the right to prevent them from dying, from ending their own lives. And so, the truth of this entire game was that Azril was only betting her life on the game, and no one else's. She would never ask Jabril to bet her life, because that's her little sister, and Azril did not want her little sister to die. Sora even turned to Jabril and said, isn't this the big sister that you believed in? She would never make that request. And Azril, for her part, just was like, oops, did you figure it out? She had kept up this lie for 6,000 years, and was tired of it. Tired of lying, tired of not knowing the answer. And through this game, if she had determined that Flugel could reach that answer, then she would no longer be needed. Azrael's intention was always to end her own life at the end of this game. But now, she didn't want to die. She had discovered something new. And besides, Sora now says that the entire point of all of this is that no one is allowed to die. He essentially just forbid Azril from dying. Nothing was really holding her to that, but still. Instead, he offered up something more. He said that we are going to change this world. We're going to make it a lot more fun for you. So, come on, let's play. Who are you going to bet on? And at this, Azril, possibly for the first time in her 26,000-year life, spontaneously burst out laughing. Possibly because of the restrictions that had put upon her. Now that she was restricted to that of an humanity, she laughed until her stomach hurt. And then, of her own free will, she wrapped her arms around Sora and kissed him. For multiple seconds, not just a peck on the cheek. Sora, she got in there. And, well, needless to say, the other two that were there, after Azril and Sora had finished, Jabril and Shiro were glaring at Azril so hard as to bore a hole through her head. They were not exactly happy with her actions. But Azril simply said, I'm glad that you invited me to have fun with you. But I'm not like Jibs. I'm not ready to stand at your side yet. I need some time. I want to give myself a chance. I want to believe in the possibilities, my possibilities, that Jabril gave me. So give me a little time, okay? Azril had been able to change herself in a mere hour, so given a little bit more time, what could she accomplish? After this, Jabril and Shiro were a little bit pissed with Sora because, well, Sora allowed Azril to kiss him. Because, well, if he didn't want it, then the Covenants would have prevented it. And Sora's excuse was just like, well, like, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to just refuse a hottie like her? Which, you know, fair point, but still. Then Azril calls Jabril over and asks a question that Azril thought of herself. How do you think humanity was able to survive the Great War? To lose and lose again until you lose no more. Suppose that that's humanity. Taking defeat and failure as a given and learning from it every time. Not fearing the unknown, but throwing themselves into it. Why did we never watch out for a race like that during the war? And with this, Jabril gasped. Because she had been shown time and time again the resilience of humanity. Not just her lords, Sora and Shiro, but also the Old King, who had exposed the Werebeast's game. And Kurumi, who had collaborated with the elves, had shown Jabril the possibilities of this race. A race that was sometimes even willing to give itself over to death, yet inevitably make it through to the next round. A race that learns without end. And Azril wonders why they never took stock of such a threat as that. And yet, records of Immanity are practically non-existent, unnaturally so. And Azril hypothesizes even further. Could it be that our forces were led away from the continent of Lucia? And also, we never really figured out what those ex machina who slew our lord were doing at the end of the war. Could it be that Immanity had led them? Could it be that the death of Artosh had been planned all along by Immanity? Azril just was thinking aloud and started wandering off, leaving a stunned Jabril behind her. Remember, this is Volume 5 of the light novel. Volume 6 of the light novel is what is contained within No Game, No Life 0. As these novels were coming out, this would be the first mention of the Ex Machina killing Artosh at the end of the war. This is the first mention of Immanity planning the events of the Great War. Most of us who got into No Game, No Life probably weren't reading the light novels as they were coming out. We saw No Game, No Life the anime, and saw No Game, No Life 0, and the impact of this is not as relevant as it should be. Because Azril is coming to this conclusion, coming to this hypothesis, something that us as readers probably already know. Well, yeah, we saw Riku and Shuai do all this during the movie, but this is incredibly substantial. Azril has just got the ability to think for herself, to come up with new ideas, and the first hypothesis that she comes up with nails it on the head of what actually happened during the Great War, how her lord was actually slain. You want to talk about unlimited potential? You want to talk about something that is an incredible threat? It's Azril. Jabril, I love Jabril. She's my favorite character. She's got a lot of potential in and of herself, but now that Azril has had her eyes open, the strongest of the Flugel, and yes, although Azril, earlier in this volume, had said that, well, the early Flugel can't compare to the later Flugel, that Jabril is vastly stronger than she is, Azril, in terms of just sheer raw power, completely eclipses Jabril. It's not even close. That's something we'll be discussing when we get to the Great War, when we get to other things to discuss there. Now that Azril has had her eyes opened and can now see the world from the viewpoint of the weak, she has the potential to become the strongest ally to Sora and Shiro, or potentially the biggest threat, because she does still see Sora and Shiro as dangerous. Granted, she's having fun. She's excited to see the possibilities that Sora and Shiro will bring to the world, so she'll probably be an ally. Especially when she next tells Jabril that in the next meeting of the Council of 18 Wings, she's going to suggest that Avontheim and the entirety of Flugel join the Commonwealth of Elkia. Jabril points out that they probably won't go for that, but Azril then says, well, we will join and become a member in name only. Avontheim has no allegiances, after all, so they can join in name only, under the guise that they will learn from Immanity, so that all Flugel can reach the same answer that they have, that Azril and Jabril have reached, and ultimately fulfill Artosh's final wish. How's that for a premise? And Jabril couldn't deny that, well, if it's for their lord, then no one would really have any reason to refuse. She also wondered to herself that if Azril was capable of this mental dexterity all along, then why had it taken so long? And Azril is proving, just time and again, in just these few short pages, that she is far and away probably one of the most terrifying characters in No Game, No Life. The potential that she has, I look forward to seeing more of that in the future and how that will come into play, because if it's being set up the way that I think it's going to be, Azril will have a larger role to play. But for now, they're joining the Commonwealth of Elkia. And Azril further tells Jabril that they can't actually accept Sora and Shiro as their new lords and masters until they see the potential that they have, until everyone sees the potential that they have, including Azril. And Jabril understands that. She will continue watching over her lords and continue serving them and writing down her holy scripture. Azril asks Jabril to look after them. Not as the plenipotentiary, but as a friend. Well, Jabril, of course, says it's a given that she will continue to do so. So she refuses, implying that Jabril and Azril aren't friends, which Azril is saddened by, but she understands because of everything that she had done up until now. But then Jabril says, "You better not wait too long, elder sister, or you will miss the best parts." Slipping in that little sister just to show that Jabril does really care about Azril. And Azril, with tears in her eyes, said to Jabril, "Don't worry, little sister, I'll be coming to get you real soon." And then she turned and started the stroll home, which, now being limited to the abilities of the humanity, was a brand new experience. Something that she decided to live in this body for a while, to take those kids' suggestion. And she was looking forward to the new experiences that she would have in the future. As she strolled, Avontheim within her asked if she would accept Sora and Shiro as her new lords. Azril simply told Avontheim that, well, that's not for me to decide. But, Avon, you should think about that yourself as well. But I don't think it would be a bad thing to submit to them for a while. Avontheim asked if it was for their potential. And Azril simply said, because it would be fun. She was excited to see what game they would play next. Azril has a fearsome potential within her, but I think she's going to be not only an entertaining character in the future, but also a very strong ally. Especially when things come to fruition, because there is so much more of the story to tell. And this story isn't quite done yet either, as we now cut back to Elkia Castle. Steph and Izuna back in the library. Izuna is now stuffing her face after Steph had finally gotten the fish, cooked them all into a bunch of meals, and Izuna is just devouring it all. And Steph, as she's reading books, is thinking that Izuna must be worried about her grandfather. So she asks Izuna if she is, and Izuna simply responds, "Hell no, why would I be worried?" Which Steph, of course, is confused by, but Izuna simply says, well, Sora and Shiro said they'd save him, so that's that. And Steph then doesn't understand how both Izuna and the Shrine Maiden can put so much trust into liars like Sora and Shiro. And at this, Izuna stops eating, which is when you know you screwed up, when the little werebeast child stops eating. And she glares at Steph and says Sora and Shiro are not liars. Steph kind of brushes that off, just saying, oh, Izuna, you've just learned to read humanity, like, there's still some things you can't see. And then Izuna just lays it down, she's like, no, they're not liars. They smell nice. Not like other liars that are just like, ha, got you. No, Sora and Shiro will lead people on, they will trick them, but they never lie. That's why she likes them so much. And then Steph stops at that for a moment and thinks to herself that how could someone like Sora, someone who breathed lies, how could he not be a liar? But then, if he does lie that much, why wouldn't he pretend to be a good person? Before she can think on it further, though, Steph notices a rather ancient-looking book on the shelf across from her. She goes over and picks it up, and it's a dwarven fairy tale, The Treasure of the Prideful Princess. As she opens it, she sees the writing of her grandfather. It is surmised that this is the fairy tale that the Queen of the Sea had read before she put herself to sleep. The princess in this tale was one loved by all and possessed all, and so she, too, wanted something that she could not have, a love beyond her reach. And at this, Steph shouted Eureka as she found what she was looking for in her grandfather's notes. Now, one thing I do find weird, this was one that was just sitting on a bookshelf. It wasn't one of the books that Izuna had pulled out due to her werebeast senses that smelled like Siren or around that time. This was just a random old-looking book that was on a bookshelf. So that seems just kind of like random happenstance that Steph happened upon this particular book. But still, she found the answer that she needed. Meanwhile, in Avontheim, Sora and Shiro are not having as much luck as Steph is. At least, at the beginning. They were in Jibril's room, which had now been turned into a storage room after Jibril had moved all of her belongings over to the Great Library of Elkia. But now, in the middle of Jibril's room, were all of the books that were gathered by the 100 Flugel that they had played the game against. All the records that they could find of the games played against the Siren. And their answers were still coming up empty. They had gathered multiple accounts of people trying to play the Queen's game. All the way back to 800 years ago. Back to when she had first put herself to sleep, when the current Queen was not the Queen. Because when she had first put herself to sleep, she was next in line to be Queen. She was not the Queen yet. And so, at that point in time, all of Siren probably wanted her to wake up and would be doing everything they could to wake her up. Because once she became Queen, after having bet everything she possessed on someone waking her up, if someone did wake her up after becoming Queen, that would mean that the Siren's race piece was forfeit to the winner. So they wanted to wake her up before she became Queen. And yet, out of the 19 records that they had found of individuals challenging the Queen's game from 800 years ago across 5 different races on Disboard, all of them were the same. Whosoever wakes the Queen will win her love and all she has. That is the same across all 19 of these records. Which means it's actually the worst case scenario. Siren didn't cover up the condition to wake the Queen. They never knew in the first place. No one knew in the first place how to wake the Queen. Essentially, the Queen was asking, "Please me," except I don't know what will please me. The Queen herself didn't even know what she wanted when she put herself to sleep, which of course makes Plum practically pass out at, yet again, the sheer stupidity of this Queen of the Siren. She put herself to sleep, not even nailing down what it is that she wanted. In an effort to relieve some of the tension that her masters were feeling, Jibril offers to tell Sora a story. She makes the walls and the ceiling of her room clear, so that they can see the night sky, or rather, the space beyond. Avontheim had climbed to the edge of the stratosphere, and Sora, as he looked out at the stars, heard the cry of a whale, the cry of Avontheim the Phantasma. Jibril tells Sora that Avontheim was the servant of their late lord, of the old Deus Artosh, and yet Avontheim has yet to accept that he is gone. So, whenever Avontheim senses the presence of another old Deus, Avontheim gets close and weeps, pointing up at the red moon that shone in the sky above them. There dwelled, exceed rank 13, the Lunamana, and the old Deus that created them. A place that Avontheim cannot reach, and so he weeps. Sora's confused by this. What do you mean he can't reach? It turns out that Avontheim is swimming upon currents of spirits that are surrounding the planet, that don't exist in space. So, Avontheim can never reach the red moon, but senses the old Deus that is present there. Giving us a little bit of lore on, where Exceed Rank 13 is, that they are present on the moon, and their old Deus, their creator, still resides with them. Sora's conclusion from all of this is that Avontheim understands romantic love, and yet I still do not. Jibril is confused by this, like, what do you mean? Well, Sora responds just saying that, well, he feels a romance about Artosh, and loves him as his master, so he understands romantic love. And Jibril starts thinking for a moment. The gears are turning in her head, and she's like, I don't think that's exactly how that works. She asks Sora if there's someone that he can't live without. Well, that's Shiro. Is there someone that he loves? Well, it's Shiro. Oh, and then Sora kind of starts to click with him. Not really, though. But he says that, okay, understanding romance and love doesn't mean you understand romantic love. But then Jibril's still thinking, something isn't exactly adding up, but something does click. She then asks Sora if he could do something for her. Could he tell Jabril, "Jabril, you're useless, I'm done with you"? Sora doesn't really understand, but he does so. And then Jabril feels a rush of emotion, as if her heart is being squeezed, and she declares that for the first time in her 6,407-year life, she's finally grasped the meaning of romantic love. This bundle of emotions that she's feeling, this unknown emotion that's a mixture of endearment, pain, adoration, among many other things, that is love. Sora doesn't quite understand it, but Jabril is basically just saying that she is in love with Sora, not just as her masters, but romantically. That when Sora says, "You're useless, I'm done with you," that rejection, that causes her heart to tense up. She legitimately is in love with Sora. And when she makes this declaration, talking about this unknown emotion, Shiro slams closed the book that she's reading and stands up and starts talking aloud. Emotion unknown. She wants it, but she doesn't know it. She can't grasp it. Azril couldn't find it. Jabril was able to find it. I know how to wake the queen. The conditions to wake her weren't falsified. I've determined the answer on how to wake the queen. Sora and Jabril turn to Shiro, and then Shiro turns to Sora with a maniacal grin on her face as she says, "Brother, even you can misread things. You screwed up." Sora begins panicking because he misread things? That's his entire job with Blank. He's the one who's supposed to read people, but if he can't do that, and Shiro boldly exclaims that, "Yes, you're normally the one who reads things, but in this game, I win." And Sora is nearly at the point of passing out at Shiro's declaration, but Plum is desperately wanting to know what Shiro had concluded. And so, Shiro spoke. And this is where the chapter ends. Yet again, another cliffhanger. The conditions for waking the queen have been determined by Shiro, yet to be revealed in the next chapter. But combined with what Steph has found about the fairy tale that put the queen to sleep, or rather caused her to think that putting herself to sleep to find whatever it was that she desired was a good idea, well, all of the information's there. Now they just have to put it all together and finally beat the queen's game. But in this chapter, we saw the final conclusion of everything that had been set up throughout Volume 5. Avontheim, the struggle that the Flugel have faced for 6,000 years, the desire to find the answer, and the tension between Jabril, the final Flugel, and Azril, the first Flugel. All of it is a little bit complex to understand. I will be making videos specifically on the relationship between Jabril, Azril, the answer that Flugel has been trying to find for 6,000 years, what that answer actually means, and so on and so forth, as well as delving into the Flugel game in and of itself, separate from everything else going on, because there is a lot going on, and this chapter, more than any other, I really encourage people to read it on their own, because I've done my best to cover everything relevant within the chapter, but there is still so much that I have not been able to adequately convey through my own words. Reading the author's words is the best way to experience No Game No Life in everything that I'm talking about. And this chapter in particular, with the amount of emotion that is present, with the amount of character development that happens in such a short time with Azril and the conclusion of this game, I really do encourage everyone to read the light novels if you can. In the meantime, though, if you guys enjoyed this video, want to see more like it, want to see more analysis of No Game No Life, and are looking forward to seeing where the story continues, make sure to subscribe to the Daily Flugel. And with that, I will see you in the next video. Ashente.